Hello, welcome to Games Industry. Today we've got Christopher Wulf here with us, talking to us about how to talk to publishers, how to find publishers, and what to do when you have found them. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be hosting a talk today. Should we get started? I think that's a yes. Awesome. All right, a couple of things just as a heads up before we get started. First of all, hey, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining in live. Thanks for everyone that's watching the recording after the fact online. Obviously, everyone has busy schedules, so that makes a lot of sense and fully understandable. A quick heads up about the length. So we're expecting roughly about an hour of a talk, plus minus X amount of minutes. We'll see, but it's been sort of like calculated around being an hour. Basis of this talk is built upon what was initially going to be a GDC 2020 talk, then the pandemic hit, and well, now we're here. But yeah, just to give credit where credit is due, I prepared the initial core structure of this talk together with Alan Dang, formerly Genvid, based out of the US. Never happened, but ultimately, yeah, credit where credit is due. He had a big part in preparing this. Otherwise, if questions come up for the folks that are listening in live, please, especially around like words and terminology and stuff, feel free to interrupt me at any given point. I'd be more than happy to clarify something now rather than you having to wonder what something specific meant. I know sometimes these business terms or like games industry specific terms can be quite frustrating, especially if you're sort of like new to the pitching process. And then otherwise, if you prefer to wait, which you can but don't have to do, we'll have some extra time for Q&A afterwards. Right, so a little bit of information about me. I'm Chris, as I mentioned. It's my face. I formerly used to work in events in various different capacities, from like curator to event organizer to also just volunteering for events or developer relations guy, multiple different roles. But here in the bottom right, you can see a couple of events that I've previously been involved with. Primarily in the past, the Indie Mega Booth, which used to be a North American games showcase accelerator-ish happening at GDC and PAX's, as well as couple other pop-up shows across the globe, but these days I work primarily in publishing, and that in primarily two roles. So I split my time these days on the one side with Fellow Traveler on the business/sales side, as well as working with them on their narrative games convention called Ludonaricon, which we host annually on Steam, as well as Thunderful/Robot Teddy. Robot Teddy is a subsidiary of Thunderful, so that may get a little bit confusing, but basically working with this Swedish games publisher to support with scouting and content review at the moment. You may know Thunderful otherwise if you're based out of Germany, as they acquired Head Up Games, one of the bigger German indie publishers, sometime last year, I think about a year ago-ish at this time. So yeah, that's just a little bit of references. I've also worked at developers before, including Salmi Games or Those Awesome Guys, which is partially developer, partially publisher. And when there's no pandemic, I typically organize a thing called Talk and Dev, which is an event series in Munich, Germany. But yeah, that's on hiatus until things are back to normal, whatever that may mean or whenever that may happen. All right, so let's dive in. What are publishers is, I think, a big important question that needs to be answered before we jump into the topic of pitching to publishers. Get to that specific in a second. Just a general heads up that we're focusing on premium PC and console title publishings today. So premium meaning basically paid, not free to play. We're not covering really like free to play games or mobile games or VR and browser games publishing or pitching, because that's a slightly different world. There's oftentimes different business models, different ways of distribution, different regional partners that you work with, and especially user acquisition can oftentimes be entirely different, especially for free-to-play and mobile. And since my experience lays with console, PC gaming, or publishing, that's where we're focused on today. But if you have any questions, again, feel free to interrupt and I'll try to give an educated answer, or will tell you that I have no clue about your question, if that's the case. All right, for anyone that doesn't know what a publisher is, imagine this. You're a developer, you're working on your game, you just want to make your game, you want to ideally make some money with that game and not worry too much about anything else. Some people still, for some reason, go into game development and the idea of publishing their own game with the idea of, hey, well, a good game is going to sell, which is absolutely not the case anymore. It may, but there's a slim chance that's going to happen just because it's a good game. Slim to almost zero. These days, the games market in total is really oversaturated in terms of really brilliant game releases every single week. So just because you're making a good game does not mean you're going to get visibility, which then results in sales. You may as well bury your game underground and it'll probably get as much visibility if you don't put any work towards the publishing of it. So ultimately, you're left with one decision. Either besides your game development team, it can be programmers, artists, composers, writers, either you hire additional people that take care of making sure that your game is known and also ultimately bought by players, or, and that's a simplified this or that approach, or you work with a publisher. So what do publishers even offer, can offer? Not everyone offers the same kind of, I guess, like services and opportunities, but this is a rather like standard breakdown of what you may be able to expect. Take it with a grain of salt. To be honest, most of these things are not unique to publishers, but you can establish them internally if you really want to. You need to know what you're really signing up for, and that out of these 4 bullet points, meaning development, consultancy, brand awareness, distribution, and platform relations and experience, is really primarily the experience in the field, which is a little bit of everything here, and the brand awareness through affiliation, if that's a thing that the publisher can offer for you. It obviously depends on how successful the publisher has been. Otherwise, development consultancy is a nice to have if you're open for it. Not every developer likes the publisher looking over their shoulder and giving feedback. Obviously, ultimately, you should have final say about your game and the state that it, or the features that you integrate and the actual game design of it. But I suggest at least being open for some feedback. But otherwise, yeah, brand awareness at the forefront, distribution and platform relations, oftentimes something that's deeply underappreciated because it takes time and investment, both in terms of time as well as financial, to really get an understanding of the process, the pipelines, and what kind of opportunities are out there ultimately. Just because you can technically launch your game on Steam doesn't mean that you know how to make the most out of your Steam release and what kind of visibility opportunities you may have on launch or post-launch by talking to a Steam rep, for example. So that's just things to keep in mind. A publisher may be able to support you with that. On the marketing side of things, again, similarly, these are all things that you can technically build up internally if you have the resources and patience, but a publisher may be able to help you with their experience. That's for press and media relations, influencer relations, so streamers, or if you're doing something more like standard influencer world adjacent rather than game specific, something like Instagram advertisement with influencers. TikTok is a big thing. TikTok influencers are becoming more and more relevant even in the world of games, as well as social media support, community management, events. Less relevant these days, obviously due to the pandemic, but there's still digital events that you may want to be a part of. And then cross promotion, something that you really shouldn't undervalue. Cross promoting between games or between companies or between IPs even can make a big difference, because if you're an upcoming developer with a rather unknown game and you can tap into an existing audience of a similar game or of a similar brand, a befriended developer, then that may help you immediately reach out to tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of individuals that are technically considered your target audience without the actual legwork of building everything from the ground up yourself. It's just a nice to have. It's nothing you should calculate around and factor in immediately, but something to potentially discuss during publisher conversations. And then finally, sort of the external services. Those are typically things that oftentimes publishers will just hand over to a contractor, an agency whatsoever anyways. But again, it's something where the experience of the publisher working with these service providers can come in quite handy. the publisher may have tried out various different people, various different video editors, or various different porting companies, quality assurance companies, and knows which ones to trust, which ones can really pull off the work within a predetermined time frame, and which ones might not be the best partners to reconsider in the future. So before you have to go through the mistake and sort of like iron out the issues of working with someone that's not really on top of their shit, you may want to just partner up with a publisher and rely on their established experience. All right, so we looked at the services. Now let's look at the options that I've hinted at before. As mentioned, if you want to have these 3 types of services covered, publisher may be an opportunity there for you. You're relying on another company, that's important to say, to basically run your marketing and other operations without too much control on your end. Obviously, it depends on the contract, but that can sometimes result in a poor experience if it's mismanaged or basically left without a way of you becoming a part of the process or adding your feedback into the process. Let's put it that way. So make sure that before you sign with a publisher, you speak to not only their scout and maybe their CEO, but more people that will ultimately be working with you. You want to get an idea of what the marketing lead internally, how they function, how they look at your game. Do they understand your game before you basically hand over marketing into their responsibility, and then you have to trust them to just do the work. Sorry. Yeah, trust is great, or I don't know what the translation is of the German saying, but Vertrauen ist gut, Kontrolle ist besser. Trust is good, double checking is better, something like that. Controlling is not really a good translation. I know, you hopefully get what I'm trying to say. Just make sure that you can rely on your partner and you don't blindly trust them effectively. Alternatively, again, building up your team, that's an option if you have the money, if you have the experience, if you know the right people to hire. Building up a team comes with the same kind of risks of just relying on a publisher. You're putting something into someone else's hands that you haven't worked with before, so make sure you know you can trust them. You may want to consider agencies and freelancers, just like on a one-off job, or something that's become more popular in recent years are publishers for hire. And publishers for hire have a couple of different pros and cons. Publishers for hire effectively work in a way that they will work for a fixed amount, not take a percentage. So they will be hired, for example, on a retainer, meaning they get a fixed amount of money per month to do specific work. You are in control. That's a big pro. Publisher will likely give you like 2 or 3 points of contact that you coordinate with, but they will still handle their tasks on their end. With a publisher for hire, ideally, there's a little bit more insight into the process, or at least a little bit more back and forth. Plus, since they're getting a fixed amount and not investing in you, a publisher for hire has an additional incentive to make sure that whatever work they're performing, you are absolutely happy with. And then finally, you can hand select the best of the best across every field that you're trying to fill effectively, and not only rely on the publishing's hiring capabilities. Some cons there, they won't necessarily go the additional 10% on top of the 100% when it comes to commitment to seek out opportunities beyond the agreed upon contract. Reasoning there is they're doing the work, they signed a deal to get X amount of money from you to do Y amount of work. There's no incentive for them there to do additional work on top of that, because that'll just burn them out and there's no upside, there's no money, there's no opportunity there that they are working towards. Whereas with a publisher, obviously if the game does well, they profit from it as well. There's more money in their bank account at the end of the day. So there's some form of incentive. They have other clients as well, so they can't just upscale around your launch and heavy times if it's not discussed upfront and paid for. With a publisher, obviously that can be the case as well, but typically if a publisher will likely have their releases spread out a little bit further, and then ideally can upscale a little bit more flexible than a agency or publisher for hire may be able to, and you're taking the financial risk. That's the final con. Publisher carries it typically on their shoulders. With someone that you hire, you pay for them. If the game doesn't perform well, that money's gone, and it's gone from your pocket. Let's look at the other side of this sort of diagram, which is funding of publisher benefits. Funding ranges wildly from like $0 of development funding to millions, at least in the indie sector. Obviously can go way beyond that. But depending on what you need, you will want to talk to different forms of publishers. Similar with services, there are obviously alternatives. There is, oh, well, that slide somehow got missing or went missing. Anyways, let's move on. So there's plenty of other funding opportunities that you can tap into. And here's just a couple of logos and companies and services that I've put together. One side, obviously, there's publishers. That can be your Curve Digital, that can be your Fellow Traveler, that can be your 505 Games, publisher that invests in you and into your project. Second option, you're rich. Congrats, good for you. What are you doing in games? You're probably going to lose your money. But yeah, hey, good for you. I mean, that must be nice. Number 3, government funding in Germany or in Bavaria specifically, since this is for like talk at the Uni Bayreuth. We have a couple of different options. We have the FFF Bayern, Film- und Fernsehförderung Bayern, which you can tap into on a regional level. There's the BMVI, the Bundesministerium für Verkehr und digitale Infrastruktur, who basically organize and structure our national funding for Germany, which has gone above and beyond the last couple of years. So it's really something you should consider. Partially free money, partially conditionally refundable, always depends on sort of which regional government funding you have available. But typically you will still need to have like 25, maybe 50% of funding for the total sum come from a different avenue. And that can be through your own investment, that can be from a publisher. So you're basically splitting the risks, splitting the costs. But yeah, that's something for you to unfortunately figure out on a regional level. If you're in Switzerland, there's Pro Helvetia. If you're in Canada, there's CMF, the Canadian Media Fund. There's no clear structure for this. Everybody does it differently, unfortunately. There's also non-governmental funds, typically project-based. So that can be your Kowloon Nights. That can be your, that's not the wrong, Super Hot Presents. There's different funds out there, but worthwhile digging into and figuring out their terms, because oftentimes they will invest in your project but not do the publishing services. So you'll probably need some additional money to then take care of the publishing services yourself. Different models. Happy to chat a little bit about that in the Q&A section afterwards. Investors, so someone that really invests into your company. Obviously, it's not on a project basis any more than they're actually getting a share of your company effectively. So you will have to be open for that. Platforms are an option. That can be your Microsoft or your Xbox. That can be Google Play and their Play Pass. That can be Humble Originals, Playdate, Apple Arcade, Nintendo, etc., etc. The list goes on. New platforms pop up left and right and then shut down left and right again. So always worthwhile having an eye out for that. And then crowdfunding being another final option to cover. Something like Vig, which I'm honestly not sure if they're still fully around or partially. It's hard to tell as an outsider who's not super following crowdfunding these days. There's Kickstarter, which is sort of the godfather of games funding in the crowdfunding space, but now tampering a little bit with like the blockchain space. So not something I necessarily recommend, but still worthwhile considering. So yeah, various different options. Here's the slide I was looking for: platforms, project-based funding, governmental programs, equity investment, and it goes on. And if you're looking for both, if you're not necessarily just looking for services, not necessarily just looking for funding, but you want a mix of both, then maybe consider a publishing partnership. If you're only looking for services, as mentioned, there's different, better options. If you're only looking for money, there's different, better options. If you need both, I think publishing is a worthwhile venture to consider. Moving on, who to pitch? That's often a very broad question to figure out. And for that, honestly, get an idea of the marketplace, get an idea of who's out there, who is a potential suitable publisher for you. And don't try to figure out like the list of 200, 300 publishers that are doing indie games publishing and write to all of them, but really break down or narrow down your list to maybe 10, 20, maximum of 30 parties to engage with. Otherwise, you're not doing yourself a favor. You want to do the research. You want to be sure from the get-go that a partner may be a suitable partner for you and not just sort of cast the widest net possible here. I won't tell you who the right partner is for you today, because that's impossible without going really into the nitty-gritty part of what game are you developing, what kind of partnership are you looking for, what kind of studio are you, where are you based out of, but I'll give you some pointers, or at least we'll try to. So how to find the right partner. Easy things to consider: portfolio matchup. Spend some time learning what the publishers out there are doing, which types of projects they're publishing. If you look at someone like Fellow Traveler, which I work with, they are specifically focused around narrative games. Now, if you're developing a narrative game, hey, Fellow Traveler might be someone to reach out to. If your game doesn't have any narrative elements whatsoever, strike them from your list. They should be on your outreach list, because that's not going to be a fit. And similarly, there's other parties out there, someone like Those Awesome Guys who's more focused on like games as a service titles. There's someone like Devolver, who's now branched out quite heavily, but used to be at the very start when they were publishing things like Hotline Miami. They used to be your, I'd say, blood, pixel, gore action publisher. It's no longer the case, but at least in the early days, you knew what to approach them about. I'd say like literally go through platforms, go through Steam and check who's listed as publishers for similar games that you may be inspired by, or you may have identified in your data analysis or marketplace analysis, competitor analysis as titles to keep on your radar. And then check who's working with them, potentially reach out. Or don't reach out if your games are too similar, because two similar games in one publishing portfolio could also cause some trouble. Industry credibility is quite important and something to not overlook too easily. You can figure that kind of information out through either blog posts, interviews, panels that they've participated in, awards they may have received, Twitter threads about developers' experience from past collaborations, and especially by talking to people. So who has a good reputation, who doesn't? Reach out ideally to developers that have previously worked with a partner and get their side of the story. Figure out if they would work with them again, or if they have particular reasons to push you in a very different direction. It's not necessarily something people are too comfortable talking about in public, oftentimes because there's contracts attached and legal clauses that come with NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from speaking too publicly about how a partnership went. But behind closed doors, I mean, the term friend DA comes sort of from those types of conversations. Reach out to people, send them a Twitter DM, send them an email, connect with them on LinkedIn, just tell them quite honestly, hey, you've worked with publisher XYZ. I'm currently talking to them, or I'm considering reaching out to them. Can you tell me what your experience was like? And either they will ghost you, which is okay, then you reach out to the next developer, or they will respond and give you some good insight that you otherwise couldn't reach. All right, distribution success is something I think worthwhile considering as well. That basically means like who has those partnerships in place, who has their games regularly in Xbox Game Pass, who signed games to Apple Arcade, or place their titles oftentimes into Humble Choice. Basically all those deals that bring in money, because you will want to sell your game to your audience, of course, but there's also so much more money to earn after the fact by partnering up with platforms and getting your game into subscription services or distribution services. These three that I mentioned are just like a few of many out there. And if that's a topic that you're interested in, feel free to reach out. It's something I work on a daily basis, and I'm always happy to chat about. But yeah, keep an eye out for who regularly is launching their games into Game Pass, who's regularly like at the forefront of new storefronts or distribution services. Netflix Games is currently around. They're upcoming. They've launched a couple of games. If you look at Netflix Games now and follow it for the next couple of months, you'll probably, assumingly, see a couple of publishers and distributors that have launched their games into Netflix's subscription service. Then you know, like, hey, they probably had a good connection with Netflix from the get-go and are worthwhile putting on my radar for the future. Online engagement, also quite interesting, especially on the scouting side. Keep an eye out for how engaged their brand accounts as well as like their personal but public-facing business accounts are. So like if I'm a scout for, again, publisher XYZ, and I'm always out there and I'm always looking for games and always engaging with developers, it's probably a good sign. I'm interested. I want to connect with developers. I care about developers. You shouldn't just take that for granted and go walk away with the assumption like, oh, they're probably going to be great publishers, but it's at least good to know that they're engaging on a regular basis. And that can mean engaging both publicly with developers as well as behind the scenes with platform partners. And finally, developer feedback. Well, we covered that. Talk to developers, get their feedback. Sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. Finally, events. Less relevant these days, but there are still online events, and those oftentimes happen on Steam. So if a publisher is engaged and has their games regularly in these like visibility promotions on the front page of Steam, that's a good sign. We at Fellow Traveler, not to sort of like pat ourselves on the shoulder, but we put together LudoNarraCon once a year, which is our, as I mentioned in the beginning, narrative games convention hosted on Steam. That typically gets a big front page promotion on Steam, which helps all developers participating, including our own developers, of course. So if a publisher is working towards visibility opportunities like that, maybe make a note and consider that when speaking to them, or consider speaking to them ultimately. Things to not use as a filter: mass email lists. There's like databases floating around the internet with like, hey, these are the 4,000 games publishers out there. No one's going to go through that list. You can use it to skim through and identify like the most viable partners, but please don't send out mass emails to everyone on that list. Everyone finds those spammy and annoying, and they will not open up any doors. Recently, there's also been a competition in partnership with IGN by a games publisher to basically like win a publishing partnership. I'm not a fan of that at all, to be honest. You should choose who you want to work with and not apply for some kind of weird competition that will grant you a publishing contract. Not a fan. Obviously, other people may enjoy that and find it suitable, and as long as the contract is out there from the get-go and they're transparent about it. I don't have insight into that if that's currently the case, but yeah, it's not worth it in my eyes, at least. Save that hassle, save that time, and actually talk to publishers that are willing to engage with you on a personal basis rather than having you become part of this competition. And as a maybe, agencies and events, I think agencies are worthwhile considering if you don't have the experience, if you don't have the network to reach out yourself, and if you have funding available to pay them, or if they're taking a revenue share, then the deals need to be of significant size for it to be worth it. But yeah, worthwhile if you have higher costing project overall. Now, let's turn that around. Let's turn those learnings around and use that as a filter. You start with platforms. At the top of the filter, you have all the publishers out there that you may want to work with. Now you're trying to filter them down. Which platforms are they working on? Which platforms are they publishing on? Are they publishing to PC and console, and you are going to be releasing your game primarily on PC and console? Cool, keep them in. If they are a mobile publisher and you are specifically focused on PC and console, or if they do VR and you're not planning on doing VR, maybe take them out of the equation because they're probably not a fit. You wouldn't want to pitch Microsoft or Fellow Traveler a strictly mobile-centric game, because that's not really our specialty. Business model. So premium or free-to-play, that's quite easy to filter. If I'm a free-to-play publisher and you're basically making a premium game, one that you pay for with a fixed price at the very beginning, probably can take them out of the equation as well. Regions is a good one to take into consideration. If you really want to distribute your game yourself in the Western Hemisphere, but need someone to cover the Chinese market, then anyone that's looking for global publishing rights, you take out of the equation. The other way around, if you already have a partner for China, but want someone for the rest of the world, and the partners that you're talking to exclusively, or the publishers out there you can find are exclusively interested in global rights, take them out of the equation. You need to filter. You're starting with hundreds of publishers. You want to end up with a much more manageable list. Portfolio match, we spoke about before. If the portfolio sort of overlaps with your title, great. If there's some somewhat similar titles, but not entirely the same title in the publisher's portfolio, that's potentially a good sign. Someone like Whitethorn Games, as an example, are specialized on what's it called? Wholesome games. So if you're making a wholesome game, here's your portfolio match. Keep them in your filter. If not, kick them out. Funding capabilities, there's like different levels effectively. If you need $1 million, but the publisher that you may be wanting to reach out to has on their website, on their blog post, mentioned that they're only funding up to a couple $100,000, take them out. Services, not much really here to say. I think the core services that every publisher should be able to provide are localization, QA, porting, marketing. If a publisher doesn't do that or can't support with at least connecting you with the right resources, they're probably not the best partner. Yeah, in that case, again, remove them. They're out. And then personal vibe. You obviously are entering into a business relationship, but you also want to make sure that you get along with people. On the one side, that's sort of the behind the scenes vibe, like how corporate is the company. If you want to have a more relaxed work environment and work with people on a more casual basis, you maybe don't want to work with a super corporate ladder publisher that will be super strict and come to every meeting in like suit and tie. And other way around, if people are just like sitting there in their underwear in front of the webcam in company meetings, maybe a bit too casual, and you may not find that too entertaining. So speak to developers, get an idea about their personal vibe, and then remove them if they're not a fit. On the other side is the marketing vibe, like the public vibe. How do they represent themselves towards their customer bases? How do they represent themselves to other businesses potentially? So go through social media accounts, get an idea for like how they represent themselves ultimately. And if you agree with that, cool, keep them in. If it's really dodgy and not something that you would feel comfortable your game being affiliated with, remove them. Now, we've ended up with at the end of the funnel. What I'd say in every sort of consideration of who you want to work with, maybe add back in your 1 or 2 or maybe 3 like inspirations. The dream publisher you've always worked with, the ones that are technically maybe not the best fit, but you've always wanted to work with a Devolver, for example. Add them back in. There's no harm in reaching out to them anyways. There may come a situation where, as an example, with Devolver in the past, a couple of years back, I wouldn't have pitched Devolver a VR game or a mobile title because that's not really what they were doing at the time. Since then, they've done a lot more mobile. They brought a lot of games to Apple Arcade directly. They've launched Gorn, a VR title from Free Lives, I believe, out of South Africa in the past, and just recently announced another VR title, I believe, from a Berlin-based studio. So there can be surprises, and you would really be disappointed if you didn't consider that opportunity and reach out anyways. Worst case, they say no, or you don't get a response, but it doesn't hurt to add them back in and just give it a try. I'd say overall, maybe don't exclusively focus on your inspirations, the like big name publishers that literally everyone wants to work with, because that's the case. Everyone wants to work with them. Everyone is pitching them. So the chances of you being the 1 in 1,000 pitch that they will sign is ultimately quite low. And if you're only focusing on those types of publishers that have so much to do and such a high bandwidth overall, but not enough bandwidth to add more titles into their funnel, you will ultimately end up disappointed in most cases. All right, where to find this information? So everything that we spoke about, I think in most cases can be either found in public or by engaging with developers that have previously worked with the publishers. Check out websites, a couple of publishers, and these websites are a little bit outdated because I took the screenshots a while ago. Lots of publishers put together like a little overview of this is what we're going for. Here's how to pitch us on their website or as part of a blog post or even as an article. And if you just Google how to pitch publisher XYZ, you will likely find something. And if not, you reach out to the publisher or reach out to the developer before and get an idea of how they've done it. This can be really easy and nice to have a resource to tap into without much work and without having to do the work yourself of figuring out all the data. Now, quickly, when to pitch. not really good timing for that, or basically timing is key, but you never really know what the best timing here is. To put that into perspective, here's a example of what a developer production timeline might look like. In this case, for the title Bear and Breakfast, the whole pitch deck for them is available online because they shared them. Dates are removed, but imagine concrete dates are integrated here into the roadmap as part of the pitch initially. So what you will want to look out for a publisher is typically like a pre-production phase or even a production phase is good timing to reach out. That's not the answer for everyone, but ultimately I'd say in most cases, 6 to 18 months out from release, closer to release than that can mean that it's just too close to be considered. Oftentimes there needs to be some form of marketing ramp up, maybe ports need to be handled, localization needs to be done in Q&A, that a publisher just won't be able to be so spontaneous. But these days we've also seen products launch or products be signed that are 24 months out and more than that. So there's always some discrepancy there. I'd say if you have a build, that's probably the best, the earliest time to reach out ideally, if you can afford that. If you can work your way through pre-production until you have a prototype or even a vertical slice, great. At that point, you have something that's representative of what the final result of the game will hopefully look like. So reach out at that point, have a conversation, and if it's still too early, then either move on to a different publisher and a different conversation, or revisit the conversation further down the line if you can. Ultimately, I think most projects, unless you have previously shipped successful titles, will likely not get signed without a prototype these days. But that's just my personal opinion. On the other side of that spectrum, just to put things into perspective here, even if you reach out at the perfect moment in terms of where your game is at, if you have a vertical slice that's convincing, that's great, it may just not work out. This is Devolver's 2019 release schedule, or basically not schedule, but overview of release titles. What you may see is that's a fuck ton of titles. So if you were reaching out to Devolver maybe in like mid 2018, pitching them a title for inclusion for them to publish, and they already had all of this on their in their pipeline scheduled out throughout 2019, likely that they just would have said no from the get-go. And that's not on you. That can happen. That will happen all the time. A pipeline might just be full, and as much as someone wants to work with you, they just can't add more on top of their schedule because they're just so freaking busy, and they don't want to burn out their team. So yeah, keep that in mind. Even if it's a no, it may not be on you. Finally, cash flow. Sometimes there's limited cash flow. Ignore the Netflix mention here. It was just a very nice visualization. Publishers invest into projects. If they have invested a couple $100,000 across multiple projects simultaneously, they first need to wait for some of that to pay off, unless they're Tencent and have like unlimited money effectively. So timing just not be on your side sometimes, and you reach out and the publisher can't sign your project because it's too expensive at the time. If you come back later, they may be able to do so, but if a game hasn't resulted in the amount of sales that they had pushed for, maybe they haven't recouped all that money that they would need to invest into your project now. So whatever they tell you, if they mention like, hey, we may be getting some money, or our cash flow situation will be a little bit more flexible 6 months from now, don't count on that happening. It's a wild industry. Things happen sometimes outside of our control, and money just appears or disappears due to some poor, unwise business decisions or just luck. Bottom line, there isn't really a time to pitch. This is like an overview of what 2020 would have looked like pre-pandemic. You can probably even add in E3 here into the June window, with Gamescom and GDC, at least in the Western Hemisphere, being two like very crucial periods of time to pitch. So if you are reaching out to someone via email to pitch them a game, maybe even these days, like avoid March. GDC is happening this year, mid-March, mid to end of March. Tricky timing, people will be very busy. August, maybe Gamescom will happen, we'll see about that. But if you're not there in person, probably don't try to reach out to people via email. Again, it's not post-pandemic now, but like we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So things are very odd and different than they used to be. One thing I'd say is avoid December. December's crazy. People are starting to prepare for tax season. They just want to go on holiday. Everyone's tired after like the fall, winter window. Avoid that. Otherwise, yeah, timing is flexible. And here, just to visualize that as a final time, don't be sad if something doesn't work out. Just because the timing wasn't right doesn't mean that the project wasn't great or wasn't interesting to a publisher. You may find yourself a couple months later re-discussing a title with a publisher, and then timing suddenly overlaps, or you can reapproach them for future titles. I mean, yeah, it's always opportunity for collaboration in the future. One final tip or advice about timing, even if a partner technically is on board and has told you, hey, here's a handshake, we're going to work together, do not underestimate the negotiation period. I've seen and heard about situations where a publisher and a developer spoke for 5 months from agreeing to work together in practice to signing a contract and money in the bank for the developer. With a AAA company that I've spoken to, like big AAA company that's investing into indies, there were also conversations that took a year plus. It's frightening. It can take a long time. I'd say typically put aside 3 months, then you're probably on the safe side. But then again, just don't make your business entirely reliant on this deal. Otherwise, you may find yourself in trouble, in big trouble, if the publisher for some reason falls through. That can be a change in direction. That can be new people being hired to the publisher that now make decisions differently. That can be due to just bankruptcy or other financial problems that occur. If you've been speaking recently to a Russian publisher, or you're a Russian developer speaking to a Western publisher, chances are right now you're not going to get any contract signed or money in the bank from them, because, well, obviously there's regulations in place due to Russia invading the Ukraine. So it's always a tricky situation. Just make sure that you have a backup plan or fallback plan in most situations. Now, let's speak about what to prepare when pitching to publishers. Material number one is a build. As I mentioned, ideally vertical slice or prototype. Otherwise, signing a deal will be unlikely. Pretty much mandatory in most circumstances, I'd say, unless you are a established developer or are, I guess, like developing a sequel to a game that you've already put out there. Keep that in mind. A build is really essential and can be quite helpful. Ideally, the vertical slice state. If you're sending over a build, make sure that there's no password protection like the zip file. No one likes that. It doesn't help anything. If you're scared about someone stealing your build, I mean, they can also steal your password to unzip the folder. Doesn't make a difference. Leave that off. It's just annoying. Test that malware detection doesn't go off when someone's unzipping your files. That's always scary when you get something, put it on your private/work PC, you unzip the folder and suddenly like all your antivirus software goes off and it's warning you like, don't use this, don't activate the .exe file. It's definitely a virus and such. Doesn't have to be the case, but just make sure that doesn't happen. And no private FTP servers with login access required, if ideally. That goes, of course, for multiplayer games primarily. If you can avoid that, that's nice. I don't want to necessarily create an account just to play test your game for 30 minutes once and then never use that account again, or send through some login details as part of the sharing of the build. All right, so ideally, don't send through a build independently through Google Drive, but send through Steam keys. Steam Direct has made it super easy for you to set up your builds on Steam. It costs you $100, 100 USD once to basically get your game up on Steam, and then you can just request keys and share those. Way easier. Yeah, I prefer that. Easier for me. I can also quite easily switch between my laptop and my PC and just stream from one device to another if I have the game installed on my laptop and not on my PC. So that comes in handy. I always recommend that. And trust people. Obviously, be a little bit careful, but send over a couple of keys for the whole team to review. If you trust a publisher enough to consider taking their money and working them on a publishing basis, then you will have to trust them enough to send them some keys. and trust them to not sell them, because that almost never happens. I want to say never. There's very, very limited examples where a publisher literally has stolen an idea off of a developer, but it happens in such a rare case that I'd say it's almost negligible and you don't have to think about that. Videos. Video is pretty straightforward. There's like 3 different types, I guess, of footage that you can send through. Pure gameplay is the best. Trailer is fine, but it doesn't really tell me that much about a game actually. Animated footage doesn't tell me shit. It's maybe like from the game and I get an idea of the art style or the animation quality, but in that order, I'd much rather have gameplay than trailer than some animation footage. And preferably send me an unlisted YouTube link, nothing I need to download from Google Drive or some other service, just unlisted YouTube link. Recent upload date is a good sign. If I'm looking at this footage, it's supposed to be the most recent footage and it's been uploaded to YouTube in 2018. I will have some questions what happened the last 4 years. And then ideally also stick to like 5 to 10 minutes of footage, nothing that's 2 hours long. I'm not going to watch that. Something that's easily digestible that I can look through, get an idea of the game. And then if I really care enough about pursuing this further, I will either ask for more footage or I will ideally just sit down and play the build myself. It can also be a couple clips cut together if you want to show like different biomes and different elements of the game. Just make sure it's not 40 minutes long. Finally, the deck, and we'll get to that in just a second, a little bit more in depth. A developer friend of mine once put it this way: essentially treat a pitch deck like a children's book, because publishers, and there's a couple of reasons for that, publishers have a low attention span. That doesn't go for everyone, that goes for me personally at least, and they are attracted to shiny things and big images. It's definitely the case, people like that in general, and if I have to look through proof of concept artwork or mock-ups, then that won't be as visually appealing than seeing a key art or seeing some in-game screenshots. So make things shiny, make things move. GIFs are great. And they don't like to read a lot, and that's, again, depends on who you're talking to, but like preferably keep things to bullet points rather than plain text. Plain text is not as enjoyable, it's not as digestible, and people have the memory of a goldfish these days. So yeah, keep things digestible. Finally, they will internally, if the pitch is interesting, share things around without the deep context of the lengthy conversation or call that potentially has happened prior to you sharing the deck with them. So keep that in mind. Like, someone needs to understand what they're looking at without having gone through a 40-minute call with you before. What not to send through in the first place, at least, is a game design doc, a deep dive lore document, or like a full-fledged budget. It's a nice to have. It's something that I can, like, at least a GDD and a budget sheet needs to exist somewhere internally for calculations. And I will, if I'm interested in a pitch, follow up and request that ultimately later on. But again, you don't want to overload people. Send them the build, send them the deck, and then the deck itself can include the link to the video footage. That's more enough. That's 2 or 3 links in an email, maybe to your Twitter account and to your website. It's fine. I don't need more than that. And I will still get a quite easy idea of if a project is a fit for me or isn't later on. And yeah, what to prepare is different to what to prepare to send. So have this stuff around, but don't send it through immediately. Now, the art of the pitch deck, the super short edition. There is a talk of this topic of the art of the pitch deck that exists on YouTube. I'm pretty sure that I can find out and can also share with Daniel to put into the description of this YouTube upload, which is an hour long. We will not speak for an hour of the art of the pitch deck, but if there's interest in what follows now is interesting to you, that you want to dive into that topic further, please check the description or just Google search for my name and the art of the pitch deck. You'll definitely find it. All right, so what do I like to see in a pitch deck? Beginning similarly to like a nice book cover, it should be just a cover image for effectively your presentation. Company, title of the game, maybe a subtitle, in this case like Adventure Management Breakfast. It's a great subtitle, and some nice key art, such as here. It's quite minimalist, but it gives off a certain vibe, so that's fine. It's shiny, it's intriguing. If this was on display in a bookshelf at a company, like at a bookstore, I'd be down. I'd probably check this out. You don't have to make this suitable for a bookstore, but I hope you understand what I mean. Make this shiny, make it interesting. I need to look at this and be like, hey, it looks intriguing. Not, hey, this looks like 20 other games I've looked at before today. What I really like is people that integrate their elevator pitch somehow in the very beginning. Like this could be slide number 2, where you just have like a nice moving GIF in the background, the game's logo, and just a little elevator pitch in here. For people that don't know what an elevator pitch is, it's basically think in headlines. Consider you're at a big event, you're at Gamescom, you enter an elevator. That's where the elevator pitch comes in. And next to you is the boss of ID at Xbox, or the boss of the main person that decides, if that's a thing, at Apple Arcade, which titles get signed. And for all of Gamescom, you've been wanting to sit down with this person who you haven't been able to find and tell them about your game. Now, this person from Apple Arcade will leave this elevator in about 20 seconds when you're on the next floor and move on to the next meeting, and you will never see them again for the remainder of Gamescom. So use that opportunity and summarize your game in 2 to 3 sentences. No 30-second introduction, but break it down to the basic of the game. I don't want to hear, hey, I'm working this 3D person action adventure game. Third person action adventure game. That's literally like 20,000 other games out there. I'm already bored. It doesn't tell me anything about your game, to be quite blunt there. What I want to hear is a good example is What the Golf. What the Golf pitched itself, maybe not pitched, but like explained itself as a golf game for people that hate golf. I have no fucking clue what that means, but it sounds great, and I want to learn more about that. So let's do it. Let's sit down, let's book a meeting, and then me, the fictional head of Apple Arcade, I'm going to sign this. Similar great example is Superhot, a first-person shooter where time only moves when you move. Now, I think this is even better because I get an understanding of what that means. It's still odd, it's still very unique, and I probably will have to see a GIF to fully grasp it, but you're telling me exactly what this game is in one sentence. Fantastic. Otherwise, general mention like an X meets Y pitch. So, hey, I'm working on Zelda meets Diablo. Can work for simplistic purposes. I generally like to avoid that. I focus on something more catchy, as like the Superhot or the What the Golf pitch. But because you want to stand out, you don't want to always compare yourself, because once you start comparing yourself, you're like, hey, I'm doing what this game has done, and I'm doing what this game has done. I'm combining that. It's like, okay, cool. Maybe try to summarize that now without it sounding like you're just heavily inspired by other titles. All right, an introduction slide. So a catchy introduction slide is always nice. You can also honestly, if you prefer, skip this slide and like integrate the what's it called, elevator pitch in here. Maybe some nice GIFs, maybe just a short explanation of like, here's the genre, here's some core elements of the game that will be crucial, such as displayed with these GIFs here. And it immediately gives me a good idea and some short insight into what I'm looking at. I briefly hinted at this before. There's studies from 2015 that indicate that we have a shorter attention span than a goldfish. It's unfortunately true. I mean, just look at the media and how it's consumed these days. It used to be feature film long documentaries on TV. Now I spend like a couple hours each week on TikTok, and that's definitely not helped my attention span. So yeah, people's attention span is way shorter. Make sure you get straight to the point. Otherwise, if you need 20 minutes to actually introduce your pitch and what you're trying to tell me, probably going to fall off quite quickly, unless I'm hooked immediately. If you want to dive into like your features and core mechanics, I like this setup quite nice of the slide, which is from Backbone. I think a 2020 release or 2021 release. I'm not quite sure at the moment. But it immediately shows me sort of the game's USPs and its innovative elements. So for something like Backbone, think about what already makes the game marketable. In their case, it's that about, I know, half of their 25,000 Twitter followers are 25,000 Twitter follower account is about raccoons, which is not a super common theme amongst games, but it's really fun. And the furry community, as far as I understand, was quite into Backbone. So that's immediately a really interesting and cool USP, a unique selling point, that is, that I will maybe find convincing or interesting or irritating, but either way, you've got my attention. The Pacific Northwest setting, to be fair, like in this case, Vancouver, is something that's been happening more and more, but as someone that's a sucker for Pacific Northwest game settings, hey, you've got my attention. Let's go. Let's talk about this further. And if someone doesn't care about it, then they already know that's potentially a USP or not, and they can sort of come to their own conclusion that this might not be a title for them for whatever reason. And another USP for Backbone, I think, was the quite complex branching out for like a 2D adventure that they had in their initial prologue that they released on Steam. I think that's also how they pitched the game. I'm not sure if it turned out ultimately that way in the full release, but still, for a pitch, I think 3 quite interesting facts about the game that I personally would highlight, as well as like packaging it well as part of your pitch deck. Look at these slides. These are gorgeous. They immediately give me a good idea of like what the game is going to look like. Phenomenally beautiful. So yeah, I think this is a great example. If you're going for something more simplistic, if you're more focused around mechanics, this is probably one of my favorite slides or slide templates I've seen before. This is also, funnily enough, by Alan, who I mentioned and credited for being like a co-creator of this talk structure effectively. He put this together for Wavebreak a couple years back when him and Functronic Labs were pitching around this game. And I think it does a phenomenal job of, in 3 easily compressed GIFs, tell me exactly what I'm looking at. You get an idea of sort of the dynamic water, which makes the game just look absolutely beautiful and sort of really fulfilling to play with. Deep trick mechanics is something that if you've played like Tony Hawk Pro Skater, you will find interesting. So here, that's maybe a good market to tap into. And then finally, the multiplayer, which again, just a single GIF immediately tells me, hey, 2 players, split screen, and online, as it says, multiplayer. That's interesting. I'm not sure, not played Tony Hawk Pro Skater that much. I'm not sure if that was a thing back then. Either way, great example of how to try to compress your core gameplay mechanics into just 3 GIFs, if doable. Not every game can do this, obviously, if you have a lot more mechanics or a lot less mechanics heavy. Now, one quick note when it comes to sending through your pitch deck to a potential partner. This is how the slide looks like in a PDF. This is what the same slide looks like in Google Sheets. I'm a big fan of Google Sheets because things can move. GIFs are great. Consider that when you're reaching out and when you're sending through a pitch. I think if there's no necessity to upload a PDF, maybe just link to Google Slides. If I want to then send around these slides internally without linking to the Google Slides, I can still download the whole thing as a PDF and share quite easily. But this is just a lot more nicer than this, to be honest. All right, this GIF, as I mentioned, please do not treat your pitch deck like a game design doc. It's supposed to summarize the core pitch of the project, not give me a full breakdown of the game. If I'm interested, I will follow up. I will want to have a chat with you. I will want to deep dive into what makes this game great. What is the bigger picture idea behind this game besides just the pitch material that you've sent through? So yeah, please note GDD, focus on what's important at that time. All right, skepticism is a big one. Publishers need to be skeptical. They are investing money into you, they're investing money and time into your project, and therefore they will ask questions and will have to also consider what's the worst case scenario for your game, or maybe not worst case scenario, but what could ultimately be the result of us publishing the game in terms of sales and revenue. So I like this quote a lot. Unlike children, publishers are not willing to imagine the best case scenario for your project. To put that into a different perspective, if you're talking to a publisher, you should also not think about the best case scenario of working with them, what that may look like. If you're talking legal contract procedure, think about what's the worst case scenario. What happens if we don't deliver on time? What happens if our game doesn't sell at all? What situation will we be in with our publisher at that point? Do we need to repay them the investment? Just a dodgy thing to do. I wouldn't sign that contract. Do we need to will we lose our IP? Will the publisher just take all the money forever effectively because they will never recoup, or are we getting at least a little revenue share from the money that's coming in? All viable questions. So there needs to be skepticism on both sides going into a partnership before things are signed, and then still obviously be careful. On your end, if you're trying to convince a publisher of working with you or signing your game, I think there's 3 steps of convincing them it's your title and your team are worthwhile investing into. On one side, the game, visualized here by the beautiful controller, a game should be made and will have an audience. Number 2, you can pull off what you're promising within budget and time. It's over here. And then the game that you're trying to make can be made by you, ideally only by you and your team, but that's a way harder thing to try to convince someone off, so let's leave that out. It's always a balance of confidence and realism. You need to pitch yourself well. You also don't want to overpromise. So if I'm asking you how you're going to pull off X, how are you going to, let's say you've developed your prototype in 6 months or a year, say a year. And now you're telling me you're going to finish the game in another 6 months. I'm going to ask you how the hell you're going to do that. And if your answer is, hey, come on, trust us, we know what you're doing, it's not a good answer. In the same way that if I answer a question that you're asking me out of concern, that way, you should be concerned. Now, easiest way of convincing someone that a game should be made is having data available. The Backbone crew did that very well with a prologue that they launched on Steam that I previously mentioned, had some good download numbers, had some good wish lists already, and quite a heavy hitting social media appearance as well as a Kickstarter that they successfully founded. And that was a good indication of this has an audience, this may do well, it may make sense to invest the additional funding here. So yeah, I think this is a good slide to just keep in mind for like a good way of summarizing in a pitch deck that a game has potential. If you're not that far, if you don't have a demo live on Steam, if you don't have like super heavy hitting social media stats or a successful Kickstarter, there's way easier ways of convincing someone that this has an audience. So this is a Austrian development team, wonderful team that's been working on Hinterberg, Dungeons of Hinterberg, I think it's called, for a couple of years now. And this was their second tweet or something like that. Like when they put out this GIF, the game basically prior had little to no traction. It had just been announced via social media. And while this was not used in a pitch deck or something like that, I think it would have been a great inclusion in a potential pitch conversation. Like, hey, we don't have a successful Kickstarter yet. Our Discord channels quite like Discord members are non-existent because we don't have a Discord server yet. We don't have a Steam page, so no wish list. But look at how much attention the single GIF received from the development community or from a player community as well. It's a phenomenal result, something to be proud of, and then I think proudly show off as well. Otherwise, market analysis, if a game hasn't been announced and shared whatsoever, then there's no data you can rely on, but was already out there in the market, and that's different games. So you will want to look at what's out there. What are games that have done things similar to me? What kind of games can I compare myself to, and how have they done? And then sort of come to your own conclusion based on looking at everything that's out there, not only, and we'll get to that, not only the heavy hitters that have performed really well, but all the games out there, and try to figure out like where do you realistically see your game being placed within? What's likely or potentially the revenue, I guess like revenue bracket in which you put your game if it does well. And then you take that information back, that market analysis, to a publisher. They will probably do their own market analysis as they should, but it gives them a good indication of like your expectations for a game. I'm not going to talk about this game specifically and like what it is and where it's from. I got the permission to use the slide. The only thing that I'd like to criticize here or point towards is if I'm given this kind of market analysis and I see this slide, the one thing I'd raise is these are all well-performing titles. These are within the top 1%, maybe even beyond that, of performing titles on Steam. It's not a market analysis. This is a best case scenario. If our game does well, it's going to trend amongst all these other phenomenally successful titles on Steam. So maybe try to be a little bit more realistic and show a couple of different examples of what's out there. What happens if our game doesn't do well? Here's a couple of examples of titles that have done things well, but just didn't get the public reception that they may have deserved. And that's why they only have 10,000 Steam followers or 1,000 Steam followers. This, on the other hand side, way worse. I've seen like pretty much similar slides to this where people have a market analysis and it's like 3 of the most successful indie titles of the last 5 years that they put forward. It's not a market analysis. This is an absolute dream scenario of if my game does beyond any expectation whatsoever and becomes one of the like leading titles within the roguelike genre, then this is what is to be expected. If I'm seeing this, I'm very concerned about the expectation a developer has because no one can account for this kind of success. Now, budget and timeline. Obviously remove the data here as well, but this is one of my favorite budget and timeline breakdowns I've seen, a minimalist one overall. It doesn't only tell me what a publisher is supposed to invest, but it's also telling me exactly what the developer has invested or who else has invested into the project so far. Really great breakdown. I'd strongly recommend trying to communicate that to a potential publishing partner as well. Like here's what we've done. Here's the money that we've invested, and here's sort of the finishing funds that we need. That puts into perspective how much time you spent into the project versus how much money you've already invested, and helps you negotiating a better deal for yourself. If you've already put 50% of the total budget towards the game, and you only need 50% of the finishing funds rather than 100% of the funds, then there's less argument for the publisher. From the publisher end to say like, hey, we funded this whole production, that's why we deserve a bigger revenue share. Timeline wise, this is also nice to have. It's a good breakdown of like, hey, here's a couple of stepping stones. We've already achieved pre-production, we've done vertical slice, and in here typically you'd include like when you are expecting to hit alpha, beta, gold candidate. At the very beginning, if you remember, and we can go back to that in a bit, there was the bear and breakfast timeline, which was a lot more concrete and a lot more broken down. I think that's also really great to include. This is just like a one sheet, easy breakdown with all the like crucial information in one place. If you want to go above and beyond, one additional request for budget, don't only include where the money is coming from that's being spent, but where it's going to be spent on. A quick overview of this is what you're going to spend on development, localization, porting, QA, marketing, etc. Really helpful. We know things can change, but getting an idea why you're asking for $1 million is, for example, is quite helpful. And then we can still discuss like, hey, we can do localization, so we can cut that from the budget because we're doing that ourselves and you don't have to account for that. So getting that level of transparency is key. Ultimately, at some point, if we're talking more extensively about working together, I'm going to ask you like, hey, can I have a budget breakdown? Finally, the team slide. This again from Backbone, they just have phenomenal slides. This is something that they've shared in public as well. Happy to link you to the slides if I can find them, but ultimately a quick breakdown of like, this is our team, this is our experience, this is why we're going to make this game, and you can trust us to a certain level of like executing upon it. The ground rule, everything you include about the team should probably be supporting you in your pitch and why someone should fund you or invest in you, and ask and basically be a reasoning for them giving you the resources that you're looking for. So include some contact information, include a team overview, include previous work of the company. That can be quite helpful if the company has a track record. And if it doesn't, then just previous relevant work of team members. Let's say you're pitching a games as a service title, something that's heavily focused on live ops, on additional support after release. If some of your team members have 5 years of experience working on the Battlefield IP at EA and sort of doing that live ops after release, include that. That's really crucial and really helpful to know. On the other side of that equation, if you're pitching a narrative game and you just tell me you've worked on the Call of Duty franchise, that doesn't tell me really anything. I know you may have worked in some form on AAA release, but that may have been an internship. That may have been in the art department. You may have only worked on server structure, and now you're suddenly a writer, for example. Like, that's not really proving to me why I should invest in you. Try to underline the fact that you are capable of what you're doing and what you're going to do on your project, to just solidify the trust that a publisher should have in you. Finally, a final slide on this topic: why we need a publisher. The so-called like the ask slide. I like this a lot. I like a quick overview of what you're looking for from a publisher. If it's just funding, then like my immediate question would be, why a publisher? Why not go to a fund instead? But if you have a quick breakdown of here's all the elements that we're looking for, that will be much easier for me to consider. One thing I'd say throughout your presentation, try to not bash previous relationships. If you've had a bad time working with your previous publisher, that's fine. That's understandable. That's something that you can share potentially as like a concern, but rephrase it, put it more into learning terms. In the past, like let's say I've had a bad experience with platform holders, with engaging with platform holders in the past. And now I want this relationship to work differently. Then I may highlight the platform holder support and add like a little phrase, a little sentence additionally of context in here of like, this is especially important to us because in previous experiences, we've had a tough time engaging with people at Microsoft, for example. You don't have to be too negative about a publisher that you've worked with, at least in pitches, because that's something that just comes off a little bit poorly. But if you rephrase things from this was bad in the past to we want this to be better in the future, easily done, nice to have, and gives me a better feeling about it. All right, final thing about the deck, the visual deck design. Just a couple of examples of a really cohesive style that sort of goes through from start to finish of some pitch deck presentations. The one from Wargroove is a fake pitch deck that they put together after the fact, just to visualize like, hey, this is what our pitch deck may have looked like if we had pitched it to other partners. This is from Cube 2 a couple of years back, from Dan DeRocha and a couple other people. Deck that they put together, which again has a very cohesive style to it. And then finally Star Strike, again another very cohesive style slides. Make sure to consider bringing on a graphic designer for your pitch deck. It doesn't really it's not crucial, it's not absolutely necessary, but the saying in German, das Auge ist mit, I think that also goes for these kinds of pitch deck or pitches overall. So if I see some beautifully designed slides, I will feel a lot more confident that your game will be beautifully designed. And with that, I think we're at a closing time, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that people have.
Right. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
There was a lot of information. I wrote down some questions that I have for you, but first I wanna see if anyone in the audience has any questions for you. Mm-hmm. During the talk, I tried to find some of the resources that you mentioned and type the URLs in the chat.
Oh, awesome! Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see. John, is that a raised hand?
Yeah, if I may. Well, first of all, thank you for your talk. Really enjoyed that. I do have a question about about pitching videos you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm kind of torn because you also mentioned you want to present, well, shiny images and all that stuff to publishers. But then again, if I'm in a pre-production phase, probably the gameplay I can show isn't all that polished yet. So I wonder, when I present video images or video footage to a publisher, do I display them like really the raw gameplay footage, although it's not that polished already, or do I try and clump together kind of a trailer stuff? Where do you draw the line there?
That's a good question. I think it sort of depends what you're trying to communicate. If it's solely about the visual style, there's different ways of communicating like what you're going for. It can be a mood board that you've put together, like inspired by different games or just general art pieces online that you've put together to communicate, hey, this is what we're going for. It can't be just a single like mock-up a piece or some key art that you had made as an indication of like what the game is going for ultimately. If it's more about mechanics, I think it's less important to have those shiny images ultimately, and you can focus on just getting some gifs of the mechanics in action in like a early production phase or pre-production phase. Then again, if none of that exists, I think feel free to share whatever you're comfortable with. Make it clear from the get-go, maybe within the first slide of your pitch deck. It's like a little red marker in the bottom corner, like, hey, we're super early. This is pre-production. Take it with a grain of salt, just so it's ingrained in people's brain. And typically, people that are doing this for a living professionally, scouts, will have an idea of like what it means if the title's in pre-production. Things are early. Things are still developing. So things are still moving, and they will have to either they'll understand what you're trying to pitch to them in that status, or you can revisit that conversation later on, or you realize for yourself like, hey, if someone doesn't get the pitch from the get-go because they don't have the necessary like development experience or background, maybe they're not the right fit for me. Either option there, I think all viable outcomes. But yeah, I'd say pitch whatever you have available if you're comfortable with that, and otherwise hold off on it. Is that
all right? Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool.
Related to that, maybe you had a slide what to prepare to send to a publisher, and like so when I'm writing a publisher for the first time, like when I'm starting this business contact, what you said was I'm supposed to prepare like a build or ideally a Steam key or something like that, so that they could potentially look at the game. But is that what I send in the very first email that I sent to a new publisher?
Let me briefly share my screen again, because there's some slides I didn't necessarily show during our presentation, but I think are great at answering that question. This is, can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Cool, okay.
The perfect email.
The perfect email. This is from a couple of years ago from my now boss, Callum Underwood, who's now no longer at Raw Fury, but at Robotitty, but I've stolen this slide from him. Ultimately, I as well consider this pretty much a perfect email, more or less. It's a quick overview. It's not too in-depth, and it gives a quick rundown of like, this is everything you need to know for the initial pitch, for the initial review, which allows me as someone that's scouting to take that email, sit down, review the game fully, and then get back to David in this case, or whoever else is pitching, with concrete feedback without the whole email back and forth. I find it deeply frustrating, honestly, but I understand where it's coming from and why people are doing it. When someone reaches out with like a one-liner, it's like, hey, this is my elevator pitch. If you're interested in talking further, then follow up. Like, sure, I will do that ultimately if the pitch is enticing enough. But then again, it's wasting your time and it's wasting my time. We need to go back and forth via email. I can't just sit down and review your game once, but I need to check it out initially when you send it through, then I will check it out the second time when you send through additional material. Maybe you're sending through a build and then send through, or first the video and then only in a third follow-up it's a Steam key. I'd much rather have everything in one place. That allows a much faster review, and it allows for much less back and forth. To also, like, to put things into perspective right now and to be transparent, the way I work with Thunderful as like scouting support ultimately at the moment is for a specific amount of hours each week. And that's basically broken down as in, I check my emails rather regularly, but the real concrete reviews happen 1 day per week when I'm in the office, because that's the easiest, and that way it's not too overlapping with different commitments that I have with other companies like Fellow Traveler that I work with. So for 1 day a week, I sit down, I go through pitches and pitches and pitches and review them. And if I review your pitch, sit down that day, let's say it's a Thursday, and only find an email that's like, hey, here's the elevator pitch, email me if you're interested, then sure, I will email you, but it'll take another full week for me to then again sit down and review your project. And then I maybe have some questions. We go back and forth via email. Suddenly something that would have been a day plus couple emails back and forth, is 3 weeks and just unnecessary waiting on me, because this is not like a full-time scouting thing for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Do you know if the way you work is like I don't know, typical for someone in the scout position? Like,
Sorry, what kind of work?
As working as scout, like, just you're saying, if I understand correctly, you're saying you would like if the first email you get already has almost all the information, like you've shown here on the slide. And I'm just wondering, is that true for like all publishing scouts, or is that do you think you're unique in that way?
That's a good question. Definitely not all. I can't speak for all. I think it's something that people appreciate overall. Yeah, yep. in most circumstances, probably, at least based on the conversations I've had with people.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another thing I was wondering is one of the filters we're supposed to apply when looking at publishers, at potential publishers for games, is the business model. And yeah. I'm not a business person. I don't really want to think about money when I think about my games. So I'm just like, I don't really care how this game makes money. I'm gonna try to make a good game, and maybe I can succeed in that. And how it makes money is something like somebody else can figure out.
Sure.
So how? I guess my question is, as a publisher, how concrete do you expect the plans of the developers, like business model, to be?
Ultimately, what I'd ideally like to know is best case scenario. Like, if you could decide this is what I want to do, what would you be going for? That means effectively, if you're pitching me a game, let's say it's a multiplayer party game, pretty straightforward, something that I've worked on before, so I know sort of the different avenues there. And you either have the idea, hey, this could be something that we are putting out as a free-to-play game, then it will have vastly different game mechanics, because the monetization there is very different of how people basically play your game and invest in your game. Probably it will also affect your platforms. That's something that I'd want to know if the developer has considered it. I think most games can't just easily be adapted from free to play to premium. You either decide you want to go for free to play, or you're going for a premium game, and that will have vast effects on the game design. Now there's a little bit of a not problem, but there's a little bit of trouble there, because things are blurring more and more together, especially as games as a service becomes so much more concrete. Yep. If we're looking at this from a games as a service perspective, then I think getting an idea from you from the get-go, is this a game that you want to release and move on from, is quite essential. That will have an effect on if this can be even considered as a games as a service title, or if we will have to replace you at some point because you no longer want to support the game, but it's still making money and still makes sense to support. Getting that clarity instead of free to play versus a premium can be quite substantial. If your team has ideas like, hey, we'd ideally like to turn this into a game that's going to continue to be run, to get additional content. We have lots of ideas, and the game from the core structure is structured in a way that can be expanded upon. Move or Die being a good example. Just the game I've personally worked on as part of their developer publisher, those awesome guys. The game from the get-go was structured in a way that game mods, that characters, that mutators, which are all like core game mechanics, could easily be added into the game without it having like causing much trouble. And that's something that if you were pitching me, I would want to know that you're structuring the game in a way that it can be easily expanded upon. That's essentially the only information that I need to know. Then if we are going to structure this in a way that it releases for free, but it has like paid content updates later on, or we do like in-app purchases or like DLCs for the characters, that's something that can be discussed together. That's not a problem. I think you going into that pitch and mentioning it in a pitch deck, like, hey, we're open to these kinds of different models, it's fine. I wouldn't worry about it. But yeah, no, I would want to know if you're in this to release the game and then move on from it immediately after it's been released, or not.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, of course. All right.
Yeah, I think that's it. Let's stop the recording. Thanks again, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.